There is a certain hour of the night when the world outside your window goes quiet enough that older sounds seem to rise up underneath it. And this is where I like to begin, in that quiet, with a story that is older than almost anything else I will ever tell you. Settle in, let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on all day. What follows happened a very long time ago, and none of it can hurt you now. It only asks to be understood. Somewhere between 5 and 7 million years ago, in the forests of what is now East and Central Africa, a population of apes faces a choice that is not really a choice at all. The forest that has fed them, hidden them, and carried their whole lineage for millions of years is shrinking beneath a changing sky. Rain patterns are shifting. The canopy that once stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon is beginning to break into islands. And somewhere in the branches of those islands, a body built for climbing must slowly become a body built for something else, or it will not survive at all. Picture 1. Particular morning some 3,600,000 years ago on the eastern edge of Africa, in a place we now call Latoli in what is today Tanzania. A volcano has recently coughed a fine layer of ash across the open ground, and rain has settled it into something like wet cement. 2 individuals are moving across that ground together. We do not know their names because they had none that any record kept. We do not know if they were mother and child or 2 adults walking side by side, though the spacing of the smaller print suggests someone young matching their stride carefully to someone larger. What we do know is that they were walking upright, fully upright, on 2 legs, the same way you or I would cross a parking lot on a quiet morning. And as they walked, the ash held their footprints. It hardened. It waited. For 3,600,000 years it simply waited, until a team of researchers found it in 1978 and stood in absolute silence, looking down at the oldest proof we have ever found that our ancestors had already unmistakably learned to walk the way we walk now. What is strange, and what I find myself thinking about often, is that by the time those 2 figures crossed that stretch of damp ash, their kind had already been leaving the forest behind for millions of years, one difficult generation at a time. This was not a single dramatic departure. There was no morning when an entire population simply stood up and walked out from under the trees forever. It was slower than that, and in some ways harder to bear. A long unravelling of the one environment that had always kept them safe, replaced gradually by an open, exposed, and far more dangerous world. Scholars still debate exactly how fast this happened and exactly why, and we will spend real time with that debate later tonight. Because it is genuinely unresolved, and because the honest uncertainty is part of what makes this story worth telling carefully. But what is not in question is the outcome. Something that had lived in trees for tens of millions of years came down to the ground, stood upright, and stayed there. And in doing so, it began, however slowly, however uncertainly, to become us. Before we go further into that forest and that long departure from it, I want to say a genuine thank you for being here tonight, wherever you are listening from. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real story told slowly without anything sudden or shouted, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to follow along and leave the video a like. It helps this kind of storytelling reach the people who are looking for exactly this. And if you have a moment before you drift off, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. I read everyone, even the ones left at 2 in the morning. For now, let yourself get comfortable. There is nowhere else you need to be. To understand what it actually meant to leave the forest, you first have to understand what the forest was. Not as an abstraction, not as a green smear on a map, but as an entire world, complete in itself, that had shaped every part of the body our ancestors carried into the world beyond it. For roughly 30 million years before any of this began, Africa's forests were not a backdrop to primate life. They were the whole of it. Food grew overhead rather than underfoot. Danger came from below rather than above. Sleep happened in the safety of high branches out of reach of the leopards and large cats that hunted the forest floor at night. Hands were not simply hands. They were tools shaped by millions of years of reaching, gripping, testing the strength of a branch before committing a whole body's weight to it. Even the shoulders, the wrists, the curve of the spine, all of it had been quietly, patiently built by life in the trees. This is the world our earliest ancestors were born into generation after generation, comfortable and in its own way extraordinarily demanding. It asked for constant vigilance, constant balance, constant small negotiations with gravity, and it gave in return a kind of safety that the ground could never fully offer. Predators on the forest floor were real, but the canopy was a genuine refuge, a place where a body could rest without needing to watch every shadow. For millions of years, that arrangement held. Apes climbed, fed, slept, and raised their young inside a green world that seemed to any single generation living inside it as permanent as the sky itself. But nothing in the deep past is ever truly permanent, and Africa's climate viewed across millions of years, rather than a single lifetime, was never as stable as it felt from the inside of any one century. Slow shifts in the planet's orbit, changes in ocean currents, and the gradual cooling of the wider world were already quietly beginning to reshape the very ground beneath those forests long before any ape alive could have noticed. What began as a subtle change in rainfall would, over a span of time almost impossible to hold in the mind at once, become something far larger. It would fracture unbroken forest into scattered woodland. It would open long corridors of grass between the trees. And somewhere inside that slow, patient unraveling a lineage of apes would be forced to answer a question that no ancestor before them had ever needed to ask. What do you do when the world that raised you can no longer hold you the way it once did? That is where this story truly begins, in the last years of a forest that did not yet know it was disappearing, and in the bodies of animals who had no way of knowing that everything about them was about to change. If you have ever stood beneath a truly old forest canopy, the kind where the trees are so tall and so dense that midday light arrives at the ground already softened into something green and dim, then you have felt a small echo of the world I want to describe now. Multiply that feeling across an entire continent, sustain it for tens of millions of years, and you begin to approach what Africa's ancient forests actually were to the animals who called them home. 14 million years ago, and for a long stretch of time before and after that date, this forest was not a single unbroken block, but it came close enough that a primate with reasonable stamina could in theory travel enormous distances without ever needing to touch open ground. The canopy formed its own geography, its own set of highways, branch to branch, tree to tree, an entire transportation network suspended 30 or 40 feet above the forest floor. Down below, the air stayed cooler, the light stayed dim, and danger moved on four legs. Up above in the branches, life moved differently, and for the apes who lived there, that difference was the entire foundation of survival. It's worth pausing on just how well suited these animals were to that world, because what came later only makes sense once you understand what was being given up. Consider an early Miocene ape known to researchers as proconsul, whose fossils were first properly described in the 1940s, found in the volcanic rock of what is now western Kenya. Proconsul lacked a tail, unlike the monkeys sharing its forest, and its wrist and elbow joints suggest an animal already comfortable moving carefully through branches rather than leaping wildly across them. It was not yet an ape in the fully modern sense, and it was certainly not yet anything close to human, but in its bones you can already see the beginning of a body being shaped patiently by a life spent almost entirely above the ground. What these forests offered more than anything else was reliability, or at least the appearance of it. Fruit trees did not all ripen at once, and a mind capable of remembering which trees fruited in which season, and travelling a familiar route to reach them at the right moment had a genuine advantage over one that simply wandered and hoped. Some researchers believe this seasonal memory, this quiet mental mapping of a forest's rhythms, may be one of the earliest true intellectual demands placed on the primate brain, long before anything resembling human thought existed. The forest did not just feed the body. In its own slow way, it may have begun shaping the mind as well. Sleep, too, belonged almost entirely to the trees. Each evening as the light faded, these animals would climb higher into the canopy and build fresh nests from bent and woven branches, a new one, nearly every single night, abandoned by mourners. It is a detail that surprises people when they hear it for the first time, that one of the most basic acts of primated life, something as ordinary as sleep, required constant nightly construction over and over for a lifetime, simply because the ground below could not be trusted. A leopard, a large cat, could climb partway into a tree, but rarely all the way to the outer branches where these animals slept, so height itself became a kind of nightly insurance policy against being eaten in the dark. And yet for all this safety, forest life carried its own quiet violence, one that had nothing to do with predators at all. Competition for fruiting trees could be fierce, particularly during lean seasons when only a handful of trees held ripe food at any given time. Injuries from falls were common and often fatal, since a broken limb in a world built entirely around climbing could mean a swift decline. The forest was never simply gentle. It demanded skill, memory, and constant physical risk in exchange for the shelter it provided. What made it worth all of that was the alternative sitting just beyond its edges, an open landscape that offered none of the canopy's protection, and for a very long time held no advantage strong enough to make leaving worthwhile. This is part of why the eventual departure from the forest deserves to be understood as something closer to a slow siege than a single choice. The forest was not simply abandoned. It was in a sense worn away tree by tree, generation by generation, by forces operating on a timescale far too slow for any single animal to notice within its own lifetime. Researchers studying ancient soil and pollen samples across East Africa have found evidence of grasses expanding gradually into regions that have been forest for millions of years. A shift tied to changes in rainfall driven by shifts far beyond the continent itself, including the gradual uplift of a great mountain range on the other side of the world, whose growing height altered wind patterns, and in turn the amount of moisture reaching Africa's interior. It is a strange thing to sit with, that a mountain range forming an ocean away could over the course of millions of years help determine whether your ancestors lived their lives in trees or on open ground. The evidence for exactly how this unfolded remains admittedly incomplete, and scholars still debate the precise pace of the change, whether certain regions fragmented quickly while others clung to forest cover for millions of years longer, creating a patchwork rather than a single clean line of retreat. What the fossil and soil record does make clear is that this was never uniform. Some populations of apes would have experienced the forest's slow unraveling as an almost imperceptible change across many lifetimes. Others in regions where the shift accelerated may have watched entire stretches of familiar canopy vanish within a span of time that a single individual could have witnessed first-hand, watching without understanding why, as the safe world grew smaller around them year after year. It is tempting, looking back from this distance, to imagine that ancient forest primates somehow sensed what was coming, that there was a kind of dawning awareness as the trees thinned. There almost certainly was not in any way we would recognize as foresight. What existed instead was something closer to a long series of small local adjustments, each one reasonable in the moment, each one a response to conditions immediately at hand rather than any grand design. And individual forages a little further from the usual trees because the usual trees are fruiting less reliably. A troop shifts its range slightly, favouring patches of woodland that still hold enough cover to feel safe. None of these choices on their own would have felt like the beginning of anything world-changing. They were simply survival one season at a time, made by animals with no way of knowing that they were living through the last stable chapter of a world their ancestors had trusted for tens of millions of years. What makes this moment in the story worth sitting with before we go any further is not the drama of collapse, because there was no single collapse to speak of. It is the quiet, almost tender image of a world ending so slowly that nothing inside it ever had the chance to grieve. The forest simply grew a little thinner. Each generation, the gaps between the trees a little wider, the distance an animal needed to cross on open exposed ground a little longer than it had been for its parents, and somewhere within that slow, patient unravelling, something was already beginning to change in the bodies moving through it, a change that would not become fully visible for a very long time yet, but that had in truth already started. There is a fossil that took 15 years to speak, and I think that fact alone says something about how patient this story requires us to be. In 1994, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, a research team led by paleoanthropologist Tim White uncovered fragments of a skeleton so fragile that lifting it from the ground risked destroying it entirely. The bones had the approximate consistency of wet plaster after millions of years buried in that particular soil, and rather than risk losing what might be one of the most important skeletons ever found, the team spent over a decade painstakingly reinforcing, extracting and reconstructing what they had. It was not until 2009 that the world properly met the individual now known simply as Ardi, a female Ardipithecus ramidus who lived and died roughly 4,400,000 years ago in a wooded landscape not far from where her bones would eventually be found. Ardi matters enormously to this story, not because she represents some clean, obvious midpoint between ape and human, but because she stubbornly refuses to be that simple. For decades before her discovery, many researchers assumed that our earliest upright ancestors must have resembled something like a modern chimpanzee, since chimpanzees are among our closest living relatives, and it seemed reasonable to imagine the human lineage beginning from something chimpanzee-shaped and gradually transforming from there. Ardi's skeleton challenged that assumption directly. Her pelvis, upper body and hands did not look like a chimpanzee's. In several ways they looked like nothing scientists had expected from any living primate at all, suggesting that the common ancestor she and modern chimpanzees ultimately share may have looked quite different from either of her closest living relatives today. What her pelvis revealed in particular changed how researchers thought about the earliest steps toward walking upright. A chimpanzee's pelvis is long, narrow, and built almost entirely for climbing, with muscles arranged in a way that makes efficient upright walking on the ground extremely difficult and exhausting. Ardi's pelvis, while still showing real adaptations for movement in trees, was noticeably shorter and broader arranged in a way that would have allowed her, when she chose to come down to the ground, to walk upright with far less strain than a chimpanzee ever could, and yet her feet told a different, almost contradictory story. Unlike a modern human foot built with a rigid arch for pushing off the ground with each stride, Ardi's foot retained a widely divergent big toe, much like a thumb still clearly built for grasping branches securely while climbing. This combination, upright, capable hips paired with a foot still built for the trees, is why many researchers now describe Ardi as what is sometimes called a facultative biped, an individual capable of walking upright when the situation called for it while remaining for most of her daily life genuinely at home in the branches above. She was not caught between two worlds in some awkward evolutionary accident. She was in a very real sense fluent in both, moving between forest canopy and open ground as circumstances required, at a moment in history when the forest had not yet retreated far enough to force a permanent choice. It would be easy, hearing this, to imagine Ardi and her kind as simply an early rough draft of something more finished still to come, but that framing does them a disservice. For the environment they actually lived in, a patchwork of woodland interspersed with more open ground, their particular combination of traits appears to have worked remarkably well. Evidence from the plant seeds and small animal fossils found alongside Ardi's remains suggests she lived in a fairly wooded setting, not the wide-open grassland long imagined by earlier generations of researchers, which raises a genuinely important question that scholars still debate energetically today. Namely, how much of early upright walking actually developed as a response to open savanna at all, rather than emerging first, perhaps unexpectedly, as an advantage even within a still substantially wooded world. This debate is not simply academic hair-splitting. It touches something close to the emotional centre of this entire story. For much of the 20th century, the dominant explanation for why our ancestors began walking upright imagined a fairly dramatic scene. Apes forced abruptly out of a vanishing forest and onto an open, sun-baked plain, standing tall out of sheer necessity to see over grass, to spot predators, to survive in a suddenly hostile new world. It is a compelling image, almost cinematic in its simplicity. But Ardi, along with a growing body of evidence gathered since her discovery, suggests the truth may have been slower, stranger, and in its own way more remarkable, a story not of sudden crisis but of gradual, almost exploratory adaptation tested first at the edges of a forest that had not yet fully abandoned its inhabitants. Ardi was not alone in offering this more complicated picture. Nearly a decade before her remains were formally described, researchers working in Kenya's Tugan Hills uncovered fossils belonging to a creature now called Orrorin tuganensis, dated to roughly 6 million years ago, making it, at the time of its description, one of the oldest possible hominins ever identified. What drew immediate attention to Orrorin was a single unglamorous-looking thigh bone, a femur, whose internal structure and the precise angle of its neck suggested an animal already walking upright on two legs at a date so early that it sits remarkably close to the estimated split between the human lineage and that of modern chimpanzees. If Orrorin truly walked upright, occasionally even imperfectly, it would mean bipedalism among our ancestors is not a story that begins after the forest had meaningfully retreated. It may instead be a story that begins while our ancestors were still in every meaningful sense forest animals. Further west in the deserts of Chad, an even older set of remains complicates the picture further still. In 2001, researchers discovered a nearly complete skull, belonging to a creature dated to somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago, given the name Sahelanthropus tichadensis and nicknamed with evident affection Tume, meaning hope of life in the local Goran language. The skull's features, including the position where the spinal cord would have connected to the base of the head, hint at a creature that may also have walked upright, though this particular claim remains genuinely actively contested among researchers, since a skull alone without accompanying limb bones can only tell part of any story. What survives in the record suggests real possibility here, but not certainty, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Taken together, these three sets of remains spanning roughly 6 to 7 million years, 6 million years, and 4,400,000 years ago, paint a picture considerably messier and more human in its own way than the old tidy story of a single dramatic exit from the forest. They suggest instead a long, uneven, exploratory period spanning millions of years, during which different populations of early hominins experimented with upright movement to different degrees, in different environments, sometimes succeeding, sometimes very likely. Not long before anything resembling a permanent, confident, upright gait had become fully established. Walking upright, in other words, was not a single invention. It looks from where we now stand considerably more like a slow, repeated negotiation between two very different ways of living tested again and again across a shifting, uncertain landscape. by creatures who could not possibly have known which of their choices would eventually matter. There is something quietly moving in imagining what daily life may have actually felt like for a creature like Ardi caught in this long unresolved period between two worlds. She would have woken most mornings in the relative safety of a tree, much as her more distant ancestors had for tens of millions of years before her. But her days, unlike theirs, likely involved regular trips down to the forest floor and out toward its thinning edges, testing ground that her body was only partially prepared for, moving in a way that was neither fully arboreal nor fully terrestrial, but something genuinely uncomfortably in between. Every trip down from the canopy would have carried real risk exposure to predators. Her ancestors had spent millions of years avoiding simply by staying up in the branches, and yet clearly generation after generation that risk was judged worth taking often enough by enough individuals that the traits enabling it were passed forward rather than lost. What finally tipped that balance? What eventually made time spent on the ground worth its very real dangers remains one of the genuinely open questions in this entire field of research. Some evidence points toward food availability wooded areas fragmenting into patches too far apart to travel comfortably by swinging through branches alone, requiring at least occasional ground travel to move between them. Other evidence points toward diet seeds, tubers, and other ground-level foods becoming a more essential and reliable part of survival as certain preferred fruits grew less predictable. The honest answer at this point in the story is that no single explanation fully accounts for what we see in the fossil record, and that the true picture likely involves several of these pressures acting together in ways that varied considerably from one population and one patch of shrinking forest to the next. What we can say with real confidence is this. By the time Ardi walked, however occasionally across the wooded ground near what is now Aramis, something had already shifted quietly and irreversibly inside the bodies of her ancestors. The tools for a fully upright life, the hip, certain elements of the spine, even the beginnings of a shorter, less curved rib cage were already present, tested, and it seems already useful. Long before the forest had finished its slow retreat around them, it would still be well over 1 million years before another set of ancestors walking across damp volcanic ash on a morning we can almost picture would leave behind footprints unmistakably completely modern in their form. But the true beginning of that long walk, it turns out, did not happen out on the open plain at all. It happened here, still mostly hidden among the trees, in bodies quietly, patiently learning to hold themselves a different way long before there was any open ground left to walk on that made the choice feel urgent. Somewhere in this story a line gets crossed that no single fossil can mark precisely, and yet its effects show up unmistakably in the bones that came after it. It is the quiet difference between a body that can still choose the trees the way Ardi could and a body that has in every meaningful sense already made its decision. That difference has a name, and it belongs to one of the most famous skeletons ever pulled from African soil. On a November morning in 1974 in the Afar region of Ethiopia, a young paleoanthropologist named Donald Johansen was searching a gully near Hadar that had already been surveyed once that day and found unpromising. He decided almost on a whim to walk back through it a second time along a slightly different path. What caught his eye was a fragment of an elbow bone small enough that most people would have walked past it without a second glance. He recognized it instantly as hominin. Over the following weeks, his team recovered several hundred fragments belonging to a single individual, roughly 40% of an entire skeleton, an extraordinary amount for a discovery of this age dated to roughly 3,200,000 years ago. That evening, back at camp with a cassette tape of the Beatles playing on repeat, someone suggested a name for the skeleton spread across the table, and Lucy has been Lucy ever since, a name with no scientific weight at all, and yet one that has done more than almost any label in this field to make an ancient stranger feel unexpectedly like someone you might have known. What made Lucy so significant was not simply her age or her completeness, remarkable as both were. It was what her skeleton taken as a whole revealed about the state of her body at that particular moment in this long unfolding story. Her pelvis was unmistakably built for upright walking broad and shaped in a way that left little room for ambiguity. Her knee joint, when researchers examined the angle at which the thigh bone met it, showed the same inward tilt found in modern humans today, a structural feature that allows a walking human to keep their weight balanced directly beneath the body with each stride, rather than swaying awkwardly from side to side the way a chimpanzee does when it occasionally attempts to walk upright. This was not an animal experimenting with bipedalism at the margins of a mostly arboreal life. This was an animal whose entire lower body had been reorganized thoroughly and irreversibly around walking on the ground. And yet Lucy was not in every sense finished with the trees. Her fingers curved noticeably more so than a modern human hand, and her shoulder joint sat in a position that would have allowed for reasonably efficient overhead reaching and climbing when the situation called for it. For a long time, researchers have debated exactly what this combination means. Does it suggest Lucy still climbed trees regularly, perhaps to sleep safely at night the way her more distant ancestors always had? Or are these curved fingers simply an inherited holdover, a physical trait retained from ancestors like Ardi without necessarily being put to heavy daily use anymore? In the way a person today might have a body part whose original purpose has quietly faded, even though the part itself remains. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on this particular question, and different researchers looking honestly at the same bones continue to reach somewhat different conclusions. What is far less ambiguous is what her species Australopithecus afarensis tells us collectively once you look beyond Lucy as a single individual and consider the wider population she belonged to. Fossils belonging to this species have now been found across a considerable span of East Africa, spanning roughly 900,000 years of time, which means afarensis was not some brief failed experiment quickly discarded by evolution. It was, by the standards of any hominin species, a remarkably successful and stable way of living, persisting across a landscape that was during precisely this period undergoing some of the most significant environmental change of the entire story we are following tonight. That change deserves real attention, because it helps explain why this particular moment functions as something close to a genuine turning point, a place where going back to a fully forest-based life stopped being a realistic option at all. Beneath the surface of East Africa, tectonic forces had been slowly tearing the continent apart for millions of years, pulling the land in opposite directions along what geologists now call the Great Rift Valley. As that rift widened, the land on either side of it began to rise, and mountains that had not previously existed began to lift high enough to interrupt the paths of moist air moving inland from the Indian Ocean. Rain that had once reached deep into the continent's interior increasingly fell instead on the eastern slopes of these new highlands, leaving the land further west, measurably drier than it had been for millions of years before. Forests that depended on that rainfall could not simply relocate. They thinned, fragmented, and in many regions over time disappeared from areas where they had stood for tens of millions of years. Some researchers, including the paleontologist Elizabeth Verber, have gone further, proposing what is sometimes called the turnover pulse hypothesis, the idea that major shifts in African climate during this period did not simply nudge existing species gradually in new directions, but instead triggered sharper, more concentrated bursts of extinction and new species emerging in relatively short windows of geological time as animals across the continent were forced to adapt quickly or vanish. This particular hypothesis remains actively debated among researchers today, and not every specialist agrees that the climate record supports pulses quite as sharp or as synchronized as Vierber originally proposed. But even among its critics, there is broad agreement on the underlying pattern that this period in East Africa's history saw real substantial and largely one-directional environmental change, and that the animals living through it, afarensis included, were adapting to a world that was not going to return to what it had been. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that actually meant for a population like Lucy's, living day to day inside a change none of them could have measured or named. Their bodies had become through countless small adjustments across many generations before them, expensive investments in a particular way of moving through the world. A pelvis reshaped for efficient upright walking is a poor pelvis for rapid, confident climbing. Hips optimized to keep the body balanced over 2 feet on flat, open ground trade away some of the flexibility a body needs to move quickly and safely through a dense canopy. In other words, the very changes that made ground travel more efficient for afarensis also made a full return to tree-dwelling life measurably harder than it had been for their ancestors. Whatever advantage upright walking offered, and researchers still debate exactly which advantage mattered most, whether it was covering distance efficiently between increasingly scattered patches of food, or freeing the hands to carry things across open ground, or simply reducing exposure to the harsh midday sun. By presenting a smaller surface area to direct sunlight, that advantage had to be substantial enough to offset a genuine permanent loss of arboreal ability. Was this a trade every individual within the species would have chosen freely if choice were even the right word for something shaped gradually across countless generations, rather than decided in a single moment? Almost certainly not in any deliberate sense. Evolution does not consult the animals living through it, but the fossil record makes clear that whatever the precise mixture of pressures at work, enough individuals within afarensis thrived with this particular body plan, generation after generation for nearly 1 million years, that the trade on balance worked. The forest continued to shrink around them, and unlike their more distant ancestors, unlike even Ardi, herself afarensis met that shrinking world already committed in body, if not in conscious intent, to meeting it on the ground. There is a particular kind of quiet dignity in imagining what daily life along the shores of ancient Hadar might have looked like for someone like Lucy, moving across a landscape of scattered acacia trees and open grassland dotted with lakes, her body already built for exactly this kind of world, even as older instincts, older comforts likely still pulled her toward whatever taller trees remained nearby each evening. She was not caught helplessly between two worlds the way her ancestors had been. She belonged in every physical sense to this one. Now this open, exposed, increasingly unfamiliar landscape that her lineage had been sliding toward for millions of patient years. What that landscape would actually demand of a body built. The way hers was, what dangers waited in grass tall enough to hide almost anything, is a story that deserves its own careful telling, and one we are not quite finished walking toward just yet. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that has no real modern equivalent, not for anyone reading this from the comfort of a bed under a roof behind a locked door. It is the vulnerability of lying down to sleep with absolutely nothing above you but open sky, in a landscape shared with animals capable of killing you in seconds, and knowing that the branches that once kept your ancestors safe are simply no longer there to climb. This is the reality that met the descendants of Lucy's kind as they moved more and more permanently out from beneath whatever tree cover remained and into the wider grasslands of East and Southern Africa. It is worth being honest about what this actually meant, not in the abstract language of adaptation and selection pressure that fills so many textbooks, but in the very physical terms of what it felt like to be a body roughly the height of a modern 10-year-old child, walking upright across land shared with some of the most capable predators the African continent has ever produced. Among the most compelling evidence for just how real this danger was comes not from the bones of hominins who successfully survived and reproduced, but from the bones of those who did not. In the 1950s and 60s, a South African paleontologist named Charles Kimberlin Brain, known to colleagues simply as Bob Brain, began a careful decades-long study of fossil deposits in caves across the region, including the famous site at Swartkrans. Brain noticed something that earlier researchers had overlooked or perhaps had simply not wanted to see clearly. Many of the early hominin skulls recovered from these caves bore small paired puncture marks, precisely spaced holes in the bone that did not match any known tool or weapon. After careful comparison, Brain matched these punctures to the lower canine teeth of a large fossil leopard. The hominins had not died in these caves by accident. Their remains had in many cases been carried there already, dead by a predator dragging its kill somewhere safe to feed the same behavior. Modern leopards display today, hauling prey up into trees or to din away from scavengers and competitors. This single observation reshaped an entire field. For decades, popular imagination had cast early hominins primarily as hunters, aggressive tool-wielding predators standing confidently over their kills. Brain's leopard evidence, along with similar findings from other cave sites in the years that followed, offered a considerably more humbling picture. For a significant portion of this story, our ancestors were not consistently the hunters. Quite often they were the hunted, small, slow-moving, and lacking any of the natural weapons. No sharp claws, no powerful jaws, no significant speed that most successful predators of the African grassland relied upon. And the leopard was far from the only danger worth naming. The fossil record of this period in Africa includes several large cat species that no longer exist today. Animals whose remains turn up regularly alongside early hominin fossils across sites in South Africa and East Africa. Among the most striking was a genus called Dinophalis, a robustly built cat, somewhat smaller than a modern lion, but exceptionally powerfully built, with some researchers, including Brain himself, once suggesting it may have specialized to some degree in hunting, primates earning it an informal, though scientifically contested reputation among some in the field as something close to a hominin specialist. That particular characterization remains genuinely debated, and the evidence for any single predator specializing specifically in hunting early humans is far from conclusive. What is not in doubt is that Dinophalis existed alongside early hominins for well over 1 million years, sharing the same landscape, likely the same waterholes, and quite plausibly on more than a few occasions the same final moments of an individual's life. Beyond the cats, hyenas of this era included species considerably larger and more powerfully built than any hyena alive today, capable of crushing bone with a bite force that remains even now among the strongest of any land mammal ever measured. Packs of these animals would have posed a serious threat not only through direct predation, but through scavenging following and harassing smaller, weaker groups until an opportunity presented itself. When you consider that early hominins, even fully upright ones like Lucy's descendant, stood perhaps 3.5 to 4 feet tall, weighed somewhere in the range of 60 to 90 pounds, and possessed nothing resembling claws, fangs, or significant natural armor, the sheer scale of the daily risk becomes difficult to overstate without slipping into exaggeration, and yet difficult to fully convey without sounding as though one is exaggerating regardless. How then did anything survive at all? It is a fair question, and one researchers have spent a great deal of time trying to answer, though the evidence remains genuinely incomplete on several key points. Group living almost certainly mattered enormously, since a coordinated group of individuals, even relatively small and weak ones, presents a far less appealing target to most predators than a lone animal caught unaware. Many researchers believe early hominins likely retained a strong instinct towards staying close together, particularly at dawn and dusk, the hours when most African predators are at their most active. Vocalization alarm calls capable of quickly alerting an entire group to danger may have developed considerably earlier and in more sophisticated forms than is generally assumed, though the fossil record can tell us almost nothing directly about sound or communication, leaving this particular piece of the story to be reconstructed largely through comparison with living primates and reasonable, careful inference rather than direct physical evidence. Heat presented a danger of its own, quieter than a predator's teeth, but over time no less serious. The African savanna at midday can reach temperatures well in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and for a body that had spent tens of millions of years evolving within the shaded, temperature-stable environment of a forest canopy, that kind of direct, sustained heat exposure was an new and genuinely dangerous challenge. Overheating is not a gradual inconvenience for a mammal. Past a certain internal temperature, the body's proteins and enzymes begin to fail, and without an effective way to shed that heat, an animal can die from exposure to sun and warmth alone, just as certainly as from any predator's attack. Scholars still debate the precise timeline of the physical adaptations that eventually address this problem, since soft tissue like skin and sweat glands essentially never survives in the fossil record, leaving researchers to infer this part of the story largely from indirect evidence and comparative biology rather than direct fossil proof. Added a third constant pressure to this already difficult equation. Unlike a forest where moisture often exists close at hand in fruit in dew, in shaded pools protected from direct evaporation, open savanna concentrates water into scattered, often widely spaced sources, watering holes and seasonal rivers that every thirsty animal for miles around knows and depends upon equally. This created one of the most dangerous recurring moments in daily life for any savanna-dwelling animal without significant natural defenses. Predators understand with an instinct sharpened over millions of years that prey must eventually come to the water, and that the vulnerable exposed moments spent drinking, head down, attention divided, are often the safest and most efficient time to attack. Early hominins needing water just as urgently as every other creature sharing that landscape would have faced this same daily calculation, weighing thirst against exposure over and over for their entire lives. What emerges from all of this is a picture considerably more precarious than the popular image of early humans confidently, inevitably rising to dominance across the African plains. For a very long stretch of this story, dominance was nowhere close to guaranteed. Early hominins survived this period not through strength, speed, or any obvious physical advantage, but through something more difficult to see clearly in the fossil record. A combination of social cooperation, cautious behavior, and an accumulating generation by the generation understanding of a dangerous landscape that could not simply be waited out or avoided. The forest was gone or going. There was by this point in the story truly nothing left above them to climb to safety. Whatever answer their bodies and behavior would eventually find to this problem, it would have to be found here on the ground in the open, under a sky that offered no shelter at all. Somewhere in the long accumulation of danger and heat and thirst that shaped this landscape, a stranger question begins to surface, one that researchers have spent the better part of a century trying to answer properly. If walking upright left these small defenseless creatures more exposed, more visible, more obviously vulnerable to the predators stalking that open grassland, what possible advantage could have made it worth the trade? The answer, as it turns out, is not a single advantage at all, but several layered quietly on top of one another, each one small enough on its own to seem almost negligible and yet powerful enough in combination to reshape an entire body across a few million years. Begin with something as simple and as easily overlooked as how much energy it actually costs to move. In 1982, researchers Peter Rodman and Henry McHenry published a study comparing the metabolic cost of movement across primates, and their findings quietly reframed how an entire field thought about bipedalism. A chimpanzee walking on its knuckles across open ground burns roughly 4 times more energy per mile than a human walking upright covers the same distance 4 times. For an animal whose food sources were becoming increasingly scattered across an increasingly open landscape requiring longer and longer journeys between patches of available food and reliable water, that difference in efficiency was not a minor convenience. It was quite possibly the difference between a population that could sustain itself across a difficult new terrain and one that could not. It is worth sitting with why upright walking is so much cheaper in purely mechanical terms than the alternative. A chimpanzee moving on the ground walks with its knees and hips permanently bent, a posture that requires continuous muscular effort simply to keep the body from collapsing under its own weight with every step. A human walking upright, by contrast, moves in a way that has been compared, not unreasonably, to a slowly falling and catching pendulum, each leg swinging forward largely under its own momentum, the body's weight shifting efficiently from one leg to the other, with comparatively little continuous muscular strain. This is why a human being can walk for hours covering considerable distance while burning remarkably little energy relative to body size, an efficiency that would have mattered enormously to a small food scarce population moving across a landscape where the next reliable meal might be a genuine distance away. Distance itself, though, brings its own danger, and this is where a second advantage of upright walking enters the story, one that has nothing to do with energy and everything to do with heat. A British physiologist named Peter Wheeler spent much of the 1980s and 90s studying a question that sounds almost absurdly simple at first: how much direct sunlight actually strikes a body depending on whether that body stands upright or moves on all fours. Using careful models of body shape and solar exposure, Wheeler calculated that an upright body standing at midday beneath the equatorial African sun exposes dramatically less surface area to direct overhead sunlight than the same body would if it were moving on 4 limbs hunched low and horizontal across the ground. Standing tall, in other words, is not simply about seeing further, though it likely offered that advantage too. It is, in a very real physical sense, a way of turning the body into a considerably smaller target for the sun itself, reducing direct solar heat gain by what Wheeler estimated could be as much as 60% during the hottest hours of the day, precisely the hours when heat stress posed the greatest threat to survival. This thermal advantage did not work alone. It appears to have developed alongside and likely reinforced one of the more genuinely surprising details in this entire story. A detail easy to take completely for granted because it involves something we rarely think about at all: the ordinary act of sweating. Humans possess a density of a particular kind of sweat gland called eccrine glands that is extraordinarily high compared to almost any other mammal on Earth, including our closest primate relatives. A typical human body carries somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 million of these glands spread densely across skin, that at some point in this story also began losing much of the thick body hair that still covers chimpanzees and gorillas today. The combination of exposed skin and an enormous, evenly distributed capacity for sweating gave our ancestors something close to a built-in air conditioning system, allowing heat generated by the body, including heat generated by walking long distances under direct sun, to be shed continuously and efficiently through evaporation, rather than trapped beneath a heavy coat of fur the way it would be in most other large mammals. Exactly when this loss of body hair and this dramatic increase in sweat gland density occurred remains admittedly one of the more genuinely difficult questions in the entire fossil record to answer with real confidence, since skin, unlike bone, essentially never survives to be examined directly by researchers millions of years later. What evidence does exist comes largely from indirect sources, including clever genetic research, examining the gene responsible for skin pigmentation, which suggests that our densely pigmented skin, the kind that would only make evolutionary sense on a body that had already lost most of its protective fur, was likely well established by somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago. Scholars still debate the precise timeline connecting the loss of body hair, the rise in sweat gland density, and the earlier physical shift toward walking upright that we've been following across these last several parts of the story. And it would be dishonest to present that timeline as more settled than it actually is. What does seem reasonably clear is that these traits reinforced one another. An upright body already exposing less surface area to the sun, further assisted by an increasingly efficient cooling system, together allowing for a level of sustained activity under direct daytime heat that few other large mammals on the African savanna could reasonably match. There is a third advantage worth naming carefully, one that touches something closer to daily practical survival rather than pure physiology. Walking upright permanently and reliably frees the hands completely for the first time in this long story from any role whatsoever in basic locomotion. A chimpanzee's hands remain throughout its life genuinely necessary tools for getting from one place to another, whether climbing through branches or knuckle walking across open ground. A body committed fully to upright walking no longer needs its hands for any of that. What might it actually have meant in practical terms for a small vulnerable population moving across dangerous open terrain to suddenly possess two hands entirely free to carry things? Food gathered at one location could now be carried deliberately and efficiently back to a safer place to be eaten, rather than needing to be consumed immediately on the spot wherever it happened to be found. Infants, too small and weak to keep pace on their own, could be carried securely across considerable distances rather than needing to cling entirely unassisted the way infant chimpanzees must. And though direct evidence for early tool use does not appear clearly in the archaeological record until later in this story, the physical capacity for carrying, transporting, and manipulating objects across distance free from any competing demand from locomotion was already fully in place, waiting in a sense for the behaviors that would eventually make full use of it. None of these advantages, it is important to say clearly, came without genuine cost, and the honesty this channel tries to bring to every story requires acknowledging that cost rather than glossing quietly past it. The same pelvis that made efficient upright walking possible also narrowed the birth canal relative to the size of an increasingly large-headed infant, a tension that would only grow more serious as brain size expanded further in later chapters of this story, and one that remains, even today, one of the more physically demanding aspects of human childbirth compared to most other primates. The human spine, too, carries the accumulated cost of this transition, curved into a series of gentle compensating bends to keep an upright body balanced over its hips, a structural solution that works remarkably well across an ordinary human lifetime, but one that also explains why lower back pain remains to this day. One of the most common physical complaints among people who spend their entire lives walking upright on two legs, a small quiet everyday reminder of a trade made millions of years ago. Speed too was sacrificed, and sacrificed significantly. A human being, even a genuinely fast one, cannot begin to match the raw sprinting speed of a leopard, a lion, or even a moderately motivated hyena across open ground. What upright walking offered in exchange for that lost speed was not the ability to outrun danger, but something considerably more useful across an entire lifetime: the ability to travel further more efficiently and for longer periods without exhausting critical energy reserves, particularly under conditions of direct heat that would eventually quite literally wear down faster four-legged predators forced to give up a chase in exhausting midday sun. Some researchers have proposed that early hominins may have relied on a hunting strategy built entirely around this endurance advantage tracking, prey animals patiently over long distances during the hottest parts of the day, waiting for heat exhaustion to accomplish what raw speed and strength never could. The evidence for exactly when and how widely this particular strategy was used remains genuinely incomplete, and it would be a mistake to present it as a settled universal explanation for what early hominin daily life actually looked like. But as a demonstration of what an upright, efficiently cooled, endurance-built body could theoretically accomplish, even against far faster and more powerfully built animals, it offers a genuinely striking picture of how much had already changed quietly, patiently inside these small, once thoroughly unremarkable bodies. What emerges taken all together is not a story of a single miraculous advantage that suddenly made upright walking worthwhile. It is a story of small individually modest benefits, efficient movement, reduced heat exposure, freed hands, sustained endurance accumulating gradually across an enormous span of time, each one reinforcing the others, until the combination, however slowly it arrived, proved genuinely measurably worth the very real cost that came attached to it. The body that resulted from this long patient negotiation was not perfectly designed for the world it now had to survive in. It was simply in the end good enough, adequate enough, resilient enough to keep surviving generation after generation across a landscape that had already taken away almost everything familiar and offered in return only the barest, hardest won foundation for whatever would need to come next. Every claim I have made across this story so far, every detail about hips, feet, sweat glands, and predator bite marks rests on something that deserves its own quiet moment of attention, because none of it would exist at all without an extraordinary amount of patient, careful work done by people willing to spend entire careers reading meaning into stone. Consider for a moment the basic problem facing anyone trying to reconstruct events that happened 3, 4, 6 million years ago. There are no written records from this period, obviously, because writing itself would not exist for millions of years yet. There is no oral tradition, no folklore passed down that might preserve even a distorted memory of what happened. What survives instead is almost entirely mineral bones that have been slowly replaced atom by atom by minerals seeping in from the surrounding rock, a process called fossilization that requires a fairly specific and in truth fairly rare combination of conditions to occur at all. An animal has to die in a place where it will be buried quickly before scavengers or simple weather can scatter and destroy its remains. The burial has to happen in the right kind of sediment, one that allows mineral-rich water to move slowly through it over thousands of years. And then after all of that, the resulting fossil has to somehow survive millions of years of subsequent geological upheaval, only to eventually end up somewhere. A researcher happens to be looking at the surface exposed by wind, rain, or erosion, rather than buried under hundreds of feet of accumulated rock where no one could ever reach it. Given how narrow that set of conditions actually is, it is worth pausing to appreciate just how astonishingly rare a find like Lucy or Ardy truly represents. For every individual skeleton recovered, even partially intact researchers estimate that countless others from the same populations lived, died and left behind either nothing at all or scattered fragments too incomplete to properly identify. This is part of why paleoanthropology as a field operates under a particular kind of honest humility that some other sciences do not require in quite the same way. The fossil record is not a complete archive of the past. It is at best a series of small, precious windows scattered unevenly across an enormous stretch of time, and reconstructing the full picture from those scattered windows requires a considerable amount of careful, disciplined inference. How then do researchers even know how old a given fossil actually is when the bone itself carries no label, no date stamped anywhere upon it? The answer lies not primarily in the bones themselves, but in the layers of volcanic ash and rock surrounding them, and this is where the story of early hominin dating becomes genuinely fascinating in its own right. East Africa's Rift Valley happens to be one of the most volcanically active regions on the entire continent, which might sound at first like a purely unfortunate coincidence for the animals living there. In one very real sense, it was exactly that, since volcanic eruptions could be genuinely deadly events for anything living nearby. But that same volcanic activity turned out to be an extraordinary, almost accidental gift to future researchers, because each eruption deposited a fresh layer of ash containing tiny crystals of a mineral that includes small amounts of a naturally radioactive form of potassium. That radioactive potassium decays slowly and with remarkable predictability into a different element, argon, at a rate scientists have measured with extraordinary precision in laboratories. By carefully measuring the ratio of remaining potassium to accumulated argon within volcanic ash crystals, researchers can calculate with genuine scientific confidence almost exactly how long ago that particular layer of ash was deposited, sometimes to within a margin of only a few thousand years, even across a span of millions of years. This technique, known as potassium-argon dating, and its more refined modern version, argon dating, is the primary reason we can say with real confidence that Lucy died roughly 3,200,000 years ago, or that the lately footprints were pressed into ash roughly 3,600,000 years ago. The bones themselves are essentially dated by the volcanic sandwich of rock layers surrounding them above and below, rather than through any direct measurement of the bone material itself. This same volcanic geology, as it happens, is responsible for one of the more genuinely surprising discoveries in this entire field, one that arrived far more recently than most people realize and quietly upended a long-standing assumption most researchers had held for decades. For much of the 20th century, the making and use of stone tools was considered one of the clearest, most reliable markers separating the genus Homo, our own direct lineage, from earlier, more ape-like relatives like Australopithecus. Stone tools required planning, understanding, and a level of cognitive sophistication that many researchers assumed simply was not present in anything older or more primitive than early Homo. Then in 2015, a team working at a site called Lomekwi near Kenya's Lake Turkana uncovered a collection of deliberately shaped stone tools, unmistakably crafted rather than naturally broken, dated using the same volcanic ash techniques to approximately 3,300,000 years ago. That date is worth sitting with carefully because it places these tools roughly 700,000 years before the earliest confirmed fossils of the genus Homo, which means whoever made them was almost certainly not one of our own direct ancestors in the strictest sense, but rather some earlier, more distant relative, quite possibly a member of the same broader group that Lucy herself belonged to. This discovery genuinely surprised much of the field, and it remains even now a subject of active discussion, since it suggests that the deliberate, planned shaping of stone tools and ability, long treated as a defining marker of our own particular lineage, may actually have emerged considerably earlier and among considerably more species than researchers had previously believed. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly which species at Lomekwi made these tools, since no hominin remains were found in direct association with them, and it would be dishonest to claim more certainty here than the evidence actually supports. There is another line of evidence, quieter and less visually dramatic than a handcrafted tool, but in some ways just as revealing, hidden inside the teeth of these ancient individuals themselves: tooth enamel. It turns out forms gradually throughout childhood, and once formed remains chemically stable for millions of years, essentially locking in a chemical record of whatever an individual was eating during the years their teeth were developing. Researchers have learned to extract tiny samples of enamel and analyze the ratio of different carbon isotopes present within it, a technique that can distinguish with real reliability between two broadly different categories of plants based on subtly different ways those plants process carbon during photosynthesis. What these isotope studies reveal about early hominin diets is genuinely striking and adds real texture to the broader story of leaving the forest behind. Ardy's teeth and the teeth of hominins from similarly early time periods show an isotope signature dominated overwhelmingly by forest-associated plants consistent with everything else. Her skeleton suggests about a life still substantially centered in wooded environments. By the time we reach later populations of Australopithecus, however, that isotope signature shifts, noticeably showing a meaningfully increased reliance on foods associated with the more open grassland environments, plants like sedges and grasses, along with the roots, tubers and underground storage organs that particular category of vegetation often produces. This shift in diet written quietly into ancient tooth enamel millions of years after the individuals who owned those teeth died offers direct, physical confirmation of exactly the kind of environmental transition described throughout the earlier parts of this story, not inferred indirectly from soil and pollen alone, but directly from the chemistry of the animals who actually lived through it. Perhaps most remarkable of all, at least to me, is how much these isotope studies reveal about diversity that existed among early hominins themselves. Diversity that is easy to overlook when a story focuses primarily on a few famous individuals like Lucy or Ardy. Sometime after Lucy's era, the hominin family tree in Africa does not simply continue forward as a single line leading directly and inevitably toward modern humans. It branches repeatedly into multiple distinct species living alongside one another, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years at a time, each testing somewhat different strategies for surviving in this challenging new open landscape. One particularly striking branch a group researchers classify under the genus Paranthropus developed enormous heavily built jaws and correspondingly massive chewing muscles, anchored to bone crests running along the top of the skull. Adaptations clearly built for processing large quantities of tough fibrous plant material through sheer mechanical force. Isotope analysis of Paranthropus teeth confirms exactly what their skull anatomy suggests, a diet leaning heavily in some populations almost entirely on these open grassland food sources, an extreme and highly specialized solution to the challenge of survival on the savanna, quite different from the more varied, flexible diet suggested by isotope evidence from the more slender-bodied Australopithecus populations living alongside them during the very same period. It is genuinely worth pausing on that word alongside because it complicates any simple single-line narrative in a way I think deserves real acknowledgement rather than being smoothed quietly over. For a considerable stretch of this story, multiple different hominin species were not living in tidy succession, one replacing the next in an orderly evolutionary progression. They were living at the same time, sometimes within the very same regions, each following its own particular evolutionary experiment in how best to survive a shared difficult world. Paranthropus, with its massive jaws and specialized diet, would ultimately not survive into the more recent past, disappearing from the fossil record entirely by roughly 1 million years ago, for reasons that remain even now genuinely debated among researchers. Though most current explanations point toward increasing environmental instability that its highly specialized diet may simply have left it poorly equipped to weather, other more flexible branches of this family tree branches with more varied adaptable diets and behaviors would prove more resilient to whatever changes still lay ahead. What all of this evidence taken together, the radioactive decay locked inside volcanic ash, the deliberately shaped stone tools found at Lumekwee, the chemical diet signatures preserved for millions of years inside tooth enamel, ultimately offers is something considerably richer and more textured than a simple tidy timeline of one species steadily improving into the next. It offers a genuine evidence-based window into an extended, uncertain, often experimental period, populated not by a single determined lineage, marching confidently toward humanity but by multiple related populations, each testing its own particular answer to the same fundamental unforgiving question that the vanishing forest had posed to all of them. Some of those answers, like the specialized, heavily built jaws of Paranthropus, would eventually prove to be evolutionary dead ends, remarkable in their own right, but ultimately unable to weather whatever changes were still coming. Other answers, quieter, more flexible, immediately impressive to look at, would prove to be exactly what was needed to carry a very particular, very fortunate branch of this family forward into a future none of these small vulnerable creatures could possibly have imagined for themselves, walking across whatever ground still lay ahead of them. Every story I have told you so far tonight rests on a foundation that researchers themselves would be the first to admit is genuinely contested in certain places, and there is real value, I think, in pulling back the curtain on that disagreement honestly, rather than presenting this history as more settled than it actually is. The idea that our ancestors left the forest because the forest simply disappeared beneath them, forcing an abrupt and dramatic transition onto open grassland, has a history considerably older than most people realize, and it begins with the discovery made nearly a full century ago. In 1924, a quarryman working near the small South African town of Taung sent a box of fossilized bone fragments to an anatomist named Raymond Dart, working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Inside that box, Dart found the small, remarkably well-preserved skull of a child, one that combined features he recognized as unmistakably ape-like with others that seemed to his trained eye distinctly more human. He named the specimen Australopithecus africanus, meaning southern ape of Africa, and argued controversially at the time that it represented a genuine transitional form between ape and human, discovered not in a dense equatorial forest but in a relatively dry open region of southern Africa. From that observation, Dart drew a much larger conclusion, one that would shape an entire century of thinking about human origins. He proposed that open savanna-like environments rather than forests must have been the true cradle of early human evolution, the harsh, exposed landscape that had forced our ancestors to stand upright, to sharpen their wits, and to begin the long journey toward becoming human. For much of the 20th century that followed, Dart's basic framework, often referred to simply as the savanna hypothesis, dominated how researchers and eventually the wider public imagined human origins. It offered a clean, compelling narrative: apes, retreating from a shrinking forest forced by necessity onto open grasslands, standing tall out of urgent need, sharpening stone tools out of urgent need, growing larger brains out of urgent need. It is admittedly a genuinely satisfying story to tell, and elements of it, as you have heard, across the last several parts of this evening, remain well supported by real evidence, particularly regarding the broad pattern of African forests shrinking over millions of years due to genuine, measurable climate change. But science, when it is working honestly, does not simply repeat a satisfying story indefinitely. It tests that story again and again against new evidence as that evidence becomes available. And over the past several decades, a considerable amount of new evidence has begun to complicate Dart's original picture in ways that deserve real careful attention rather than being quietly smoothed over. The first serious challenge came from the very fossils that were meant to confirm the savanna hypothesis most directly. Remember Ardi, the remarkably complete skeleton described earlier tonight, dated to roughly 4,400,000 years ago. When researchers carefully examined not just her bones, but the fossilized seeds, pollen and small animal remains found in the same sediment layers surrounding her, the picture that emerged was not the open, treeless grassland that Dart's original hypothesis would have predicted for an early upright walking hominin. It was instead a fairly substantially wooded environment, closer to what researchers now often describe as woodland, or at most a heavily treed mosaic landscape rather than genuine open savanna in the way that term is popularly understood. If one of the earliest, most significant steps toward upright walking occurred while the surrounding environment still included substantial tree cover, then the simple dramatic story of open grassland directly forcing bipedalism into existence becomes considerably harder to defend in its original straightforward form. Around this same broader period, researchers studying fossil soils across multiple sites in East Africa began applying increasingly sophisticated techniques to reconstruct exactly what these ancient landscapes actually looked like, rather than relying on assumption or the general impression left by the fossils themselves. One particularly revealing method involves analyzing carbon isotopes preserved in ancient soil, in a manner similar to the tooth enamel analysis described earlier, but applied here to reconstruct entire ecosystems rather than individual diets. This soil-based evidence, gathered patiently across numerous sites and published extensively over the past 2 decades, has painted a picture consistently more complicated, more mixed, more genuinely mosaic in character than the classic savanna hypothesis originally proposed. Rather than a single clean transition from closed forest to open grassland, the honest picture that emerges looks considerably messier, patches of woodland persisting alongside expanding grassland for enormous stretches of time, with the exact balance between the two shifting considerably from region to region, from one time period to the next. A team of researchers, led by geochemist Thura Serling, captured this complexity particularly well in an influential study published in the journal Nature in 2011, examining carbon isotope evidence gathered from soil samples spanning roughly the last 6 million years across multiple East African sites. Their findings showed clearly that tree cover in these regions fluctuated considerably, sometimes quite dramatically across this period, rather than following any simple, single-directional decline from forest to open grassland. Some periods and locations genuinely did approach the open grassland conditions Dart originally imagined. Others, even at broadly similar points in time, remained considerably more wooded. What this suggests taken as a whole is that early hominins were not moving through a single uniform transition from one environment to another, but were instead navigating a genuinely variable shifting mosaic of conditions, sometimes wooded, sometimes considerably more open, often changing meaningfully within a single individual's own lifetime. This growing body of evidence has led a considerable number of researchers, though certainly not all, to argue that the traditional savanna hypothesis, at least in its original simplest form, has effectively been set aside by more recent, more carefully gathered evidence. Some have gone further still, turning to living primates rather than fossils alone to test these ideas directly. In the Issa Valley of western Tanzania, researchers have spent years carefully observing a population of wild chimpanzees living in an environment genuinely similar in terms of vegetation and openness to what many early hominins likely experienced. If the traditional savanna hypothesis were correct in its most straightforward form, one might reasonably expect these particular chimpanzees living in relatively open savanna like woodland rather than dense rainforest to spend noticeably more time walking upright on the ground, since that environment offers considerably less continuous tree cover for climbing. What researchers have actually observed, published in detailed studies over the past several years, is somewhat different and genuinely surprising to some in the field. These savanna-dwelling chimpanzees continue to spend the great majority of their time in the trees, arguably relying on tree cover, if anything slightly more than some forest-dwelling. Chimpanzee populations do elsewhere, apparently because trees in this more open resource scarce environment still offer meaningfully safer, more reliable access to food and protection than the ground does. Findings like these have led a number of researchers to propose an alternative explanation for the origins of upright walking, one considerably different in emphasis from Dart's original story. Rather than bipedalism emerging primarily as a response to open ground, Some now argue it may have first proven useful within the trees themselves, an efficient way of moving carefully along larger branches while reaching outward for fruit on smaller, less stable ones. A behavior observed directly in certain populations of modern orangutans navigating similarly challenging canopy structures. Under this view, walking upright would have been, in its earliest form, primarily an arboreal adaptation, something that happened to also prove useful on the ground later, rather than an adaptation invented specifically because the ground itself demanded it. I want to be genuinely careful here, because it would be easy at this point in the story to simply declare one interpretation correct and move on, and that would not be honest to what is actually happening within this field of research right now. The debate over exactly how much credit belongs to open savanna versus mosaic woodland versus even genuinely arboreal environments remains real ongoing, and in places quite pointed among serious, well-credentialed researchers. Some scholars, including certain paleoanthropologists who have spent entire careers studying this exact question, continue to argue that the underlying logic of the savanna hypothesis, properly refined and updated to account for the more accurate mosaic picture now supported by soil evidence, remains genuinely strong, even if its original simplest 1920s version required real revision. Other researchers argue the evidence now points toward a picture different enough in both emphasis and mechanism that continuing to use the term savanna hypothesis at all risks misleading people about what the fossil and environmental evidence actually shows. What almost everyone currently working in this field does agree upon, regardless of which particular side of this more specific debate they lean toward, is that the old simplest version of the story, one abrupt decisive shift from forest to savanna immediately and directly producing upright walking, as a clean, singular response, does not hold up particularly well against the full weight of evidence gathered over the past several decades. The true picture, however researchers ultimately choose to label, it was slower, messier, more regionally variable, and considerably more experimental than that original narrative allowed for unfolding across an enormous span of time in landscapes that shifted repeatedly between wooded and open conditions, rather than moving cleanly and permanently in a single direction. There is something worth genuinely appreciating in this ongoing disagreement, rather than finding it merely frustrating or unresolved. It reflects a field of researchers still actively carefully testing its own foundational assumptions, still willing to set aside a comfortable, well-established story when new evidence patiently gathered from soil, from teeth, from the careful observation of living chimpanzees in the wild, genuinely calls that story into meaningful question. This is not scientific uncertainty as failure. It is scientific uncertainty functioning exactly as it should, and the fact that researchers can hold this debate seriously, respectfully, and based on real physical evidence is itself part of why this particular corner of history deserves to be trusted even in the places where it remains genuinely, honestly unresolved. What can we say then with real confidence, setting aside the details still actively debated among specialists? The forests of ancient Africa did shrink meaningfully and measurably across millions of years, even if that shrinking occurred less as a single clean sweep and more as an uneven, regionally variable retreat advancing in some places, while other pockets of woodland persisted stubbornly for considerably longer. Early hominins did eventually come to walk upright reliably and permanently, whatever the precise mixture of forces, arboreal, terrestrial, or some genuinely tangled combination of the two that first made that particular body plan advantageous. And the world these early upright walkers eventually had to survive in, whatever specific balance of tree and open ground defined it in any given place and moment, was undeniably more exposed, more physically demanding, and more dangerous than the deep forest their much more distant ancestors had called home for tens of millions of years before any of this slow, uncertain unraveling ever began. Perhaps that is the truest way to hold this particular chapter of the story in mind as we continue forward tonight. not as a single tidy answer waiting to be memorized, but as a genuine, still unfolding scientific conversation carried forward by careful people looking honestly at incomplete evidence, doing their patient best to understand something that happened so long ago and so slowly that certainty itself may simply be too much to ask of any single line of evidence alone. What comes next in this story does not require that debate to be fully settled. It only asks us to keep walking forward with the same patient, honest attention these researchers themselves have brought to every difficult question standing in their way. There is a particular kind of quiet transformation that tends to escape notice in most retellings of this story, because it did not happen in the legs or the hips, or anywhere visible from the outside at all. It happened slowly and almost invisibly inside the skull, and it may be the single most consequential change to emerge from everything this story has described so far tonight. To understand why it helps to return briefly to something mentioned earlier, only in passing the freeing of the hands that came along with fully committed upright walking. A body no longer needing its hands simply to get from place to place gains something considerably more valuable than convenience. It gains the capacity for genuinely sustained, careful manipulation, the kind required not merely to pick up a stone, but to select one stone deliberately from among many, to strike it against another with precise repeated control, and to produce from that controlled violence a sharp edge capable of cutting through skin, muscle, and tendon that unmodified teeth and fingernails simply could not manage on their own. This is roughly the world researchers step into around 2,600,000 years ago, in a period marked by the earliest widespread evidence of what archaeologists now call Oldowan technology, named for the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where Lewis and Mary Leakey first properly documented these tools in significant quantity during the 1930s. The tools themselves, seen without context, might seem almost disappointingly simple, little more than fist-sized stones with a few sharp flakes deliberately struck away along one edge. But simplicity in this particular case is genuinely misleading. Producing even the most basic Oldowan flake requires understanding at some real cognitive level how stone actually fractures, selecting the correct angle to strike, applying force with real precision and control, and recognizing before striking which of two available stones will make a better core and which will make a better hammer. Researchers who have spent years attempting to teach modern humans this exact technique, often using the very same raw materials, report that it takes considerably longer to master than casual observation of the finished tools would ever suggest. What these humble tools actually made possible changes the entire remaining trajectory of this story in a way that deserves real attention. Cut marks preserved directly on ancient animal bones, visible under careful microscopic examination and clearly distinguishable from the marks left by predator teeth described earlier tonight, confirm that these early tool users were accessing meat, and doing so with real regularity by roughly 2,600,000 years ago, and quite possibly somewhat earlier still. This detail matters enormously, and it is worth sitting with exactly why. Meat represents an extraordinarily dense, efficient source of both calories and protein compared to almost any plant food available on the African savanna, and a body capable of accessing it reliably gains access to considerably more available energy for a given amount of foraging time and effort spent. Here, a genuinely fascinating and still actively studied question emerges, one scholars continue to investigate with real scientific care rather than settled certainty. Did these small hominins actually hunt the animals whose bones show these tool marks, or did they instead scavenge meat already killed by other predators, arriving at a carcass after a lion or leopard had already fed and departed, using their sharp stone tools to quickly strip away whatever meat still remained before hyenas or vultures could claim it first? The evidence remains genuinely mixed on this question, and it likely varied considerably by circumstance and opportunity rather following any single consistent pattern. Some cut marks on ancient bones appear layered directly beneath tooth marks left by large carnivores, suggesting the hominins arrived first at a fresh kill before other predators had finished. Others show the reverse pattern, hominin cut marks layered clearly on top of carnivore tooth marks, suggesting scavenging from an already partially consumed carcass instead. What seems most likely based on this mixed evidence is that early tool users were considerably more opportunistic and flexible than either label hunter or scavenger fully captures on its own, taking meat wherever and however circumstance made it available, rather than committing exclusively to one particular strategy. Whatever the precise mixture of hunting and scavenging involved, the consequence for the body and particularly for the brain appears to have been substantial. Brain tissue is, in purely metabolic terms, extraordinarily expensive to maintain, consuming a genuinely disproportionate share of the body's total daily energy relative to its actual size and weight. In modern humans, the brain accounts for only about 2% of total body weight, yet consumes somewhere close to 20% of the body's total resting energy expenditure, an extraordinary metabolic cost that a body existing on the margins of survival in an unpredictable, dangerous landscape could not easily afford to pay, without some genuinely significant offsetting benefit. A more reliable, calorie-dense source of food of exactly the kind that meat could increasingly provide offers one plausible, though not universally agreed upon, explanation for how a body under such considerable survival pressure could nonetheless begin affording the energetic cost of a gradually larger, more capable brain. The fossil record does show exactly this kind of gradual brain growth, beginning to appear roughly alongside this period of increasing stone tool use and meat consumption in a set of hominins. Researchers eventually classified within our own genus Homo for the first time. Homo habilis, whose name translates roughly to handy man, a label chosen specifically because early specimens were found closely associated with Oldowan stone tools, appears in the fossil record by around 2,400,000 years ago, with a brain size measurably, if still modestly larger than that of the Australopithecus populations that came before. It would be a mistake, and one this channel tries carefully to avoid, to suggest tool use and meat eating alone fully explain everything about why brain size began increasing during this particular period, since scholars still debate the relative importance of diet-changing social complexity and shifting environmental demands in driving this particular transition. And the true answer almost certainly involves several of these pressures reinforcing one another rather than any single isolated cause acting alone. What is considerably less debated and genuinely worth pausing on is what a larger, more expensive brain likely demanded in return from the social lives of the individuals carrying it. A brain this metabolically costly does not develop in isolation from behavior. It appears to have required, and in turn likely helped, enable meaningfully increased cooperation among individuals living together. Sharing food, particularly a genuinely valuable, hard-won resource like fresh meat from a kill or scavenged carcass distributed deliberately among group members rather than consumed immediately and entirely by whoever happened to find it first, represents a real behavioral shift from what researchers observe among most other primates, including our closest living relatives. Some researchers have proposed that this pattern of deliberate food sharing may have laid important early groundwork for the more extensive social cooperation and division of labor that would become increasingly central to human survival strategies in the period still ahead of this story. Children too occupy a genuinely different position within this unfolding picture than they had in earlier chapters of this story. And this detail tends to surprise people when they first encounter it clearly. A larger, more metabolically demanding brain does not simply appear fully formed at birth. It requires an extended period of continued growth and development after birth, considerably longer relative to overall body size than is typical for most other primates, including our closest ape relatives. This extended period of childhood dependency in turn likely placed real additional demands on the adults responsible for provisioning and protecting these slower developing young across a landscape that, as earlier parts of this story have made clear, offered no shortage of genuine daily danger. Some researchers have suggested this particular pressure may help explain why cooperative childcare, older siblings, other adults, and not merely a mother alone, contributing meaningfully to feeding and protecting the young, appears to have become an increasingly important feature of hominin social life during precisely this period, a pattern considerably less pronounced among most other living great apes, where mothers typically shoulder the overwhelming majority of correct infant care largely alone. There is something worth noting honestly here, a genuine open question rather than a settled conclusion. We cannot know with anything approaching real certainty exactly how emotionally similar these ancient cooperative behaviors were to what we would recognize today as compassion or concern or love in any sense a modern person would immediately understand. The fossil and archaeological record can show us behavior. It cannot show us with any real confidence the inner experience that may or may not have accompanied that behavior millions of years before language existed to describe or even fully form such experiences in the first place. What the evidence can tell us with reasonable confidence is that the basic architecture of cooperation, shared food, shared childcare, coordinated behavior benefiting the wider group rather than only the individual acting alone was already meaningfully present by this point in the story, considerably earlier than many people realize, and considerably earlier than the more dramatic, more frequently discussed chapters of human prehistory that would eventually follow. What emerges from all of this taken together? The sharp-edged stone tools, the cut-marked bones, the gradually expanding brain, the increasingly cooperative social behavior required to support it is a picture of a lineage that had by this point genuinely stopped simply reacting to the dangerous open world its ancestors had been forced into. It had begun slowly, and in ways its members could not possibly have understood or intended, actively reshaping that relationship instead, using freed hands and a slowly growing brain to extract more from a difficult landscape than raw physical strength or speed alone could ever have provided. The forest was long gone by this point and would remain gone. But something considerably more resourceful than the animals who first stepped fully out from beneath its canopy had quietly and patiently begun to take its place. For most of this evening, the world we have been describing has stayed within a fairly narrow stretch of the African continent, the Rift Valley, and the region surrounding it, watching one lineage slowly, patiently rebuild itself, body and behavior together in response to a forest that kept disappearing beneath it. What happens next in this story is, in a very real sense, the natural continuation of everything that particular rebuilding made possible, a moment when the body finally became capable of something no hominin before it had ever managed. It began to walk beyond Africa in The clearest, most complete evidence for what this body had actually become comes from a discovery made in 1984 along the dry banks of a seasonal river near Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. A skilled fossil hunter named Kamoya Kimiu, working alongside paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey's research team, spotted a small fragment of skullcap eroding from a hillside barely visible above the surrounding sediment. What followed was one of the most careful, painstaking excavations in the entire history of this field, ultimately recovering roughly 80% of a single skeleton, an extraordinary level of completeness for a hominin fossil of this age. The individual, now known to researchers as the Nario Kotumi boy, or sometimes simply Turkana boy, lived and died approximately 1,600,000 years ago. What skeletal analysis suggests was somewhere between 8 and 12 years of age. A young life ended, based on evidence in the bones themselves, possibly by an infection that spread following a dental abscess, A small ordinary tragedy that would have meant almost certain death in a world without any of the medical understanding we now take for granted. What makes this particular skeleton so significant is not primarily the sadness of that early death, though it is worth pausing on for a moment with real feeling, but what the bones themselves reveal about the body this child inhabited. Unlike Lucy, whose skeleton still carried real traces of an earlier, more mixed relationship with the trees, curved fingers, a shoulder built for reasonable climbing, the Nario Kotume boy's skeleton shows a body that has in almost every meaningful respect fully arrived at something recognizably, unmistakably human in its basic proportions: long, straight legs, a narrow pelvis built entirely for efficient upright walking with none of the compromises still visible in earlier hominin skeletons, a rib cage that curves inward toward the waist rather than flaring outward the way an ape's does, creating the same narrow, efficient torso shape modern humans still carry today. Researchers estimate that had this particular individual survived into adulthood, he would likely have stood somewhere close to 6 feet tall, a height that would not look remotely unusual walking down a street in any city in the world today. This body belonged to a hominin species researchers classify as Homo erectus, meaning upright man, a name given somewhat ironically considering how much earlier true upright walking had actually developed, but reflecting how strikingly complete and modern that upright posture finally appears within this particular lineage. Homo erectus first appears in the African fossil record by roughly 1,900,000 years ago, considerably larger brained than Homo habilis before it, and equipped for the first time in this entire story with a body seemingly built not merely to survive on the African savanna, but to travel across it and eventually well beyond it with genuine sustained efficiency. And travel it did in a way that still genuinely surprises people encountering this part of the story for the first time. Every hominin discussed across this evening so far, Ardy Lucy, the various branches of Australopithecus and Pranthropus, all of them lived and died entirely within the African continent, their remains found exclusively across Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania and South Africa. Homo erectus breaks that pattern completely and does so remarkably early in its history as a species. In a limestone cave near the town of Dmanisi in the country of Georgia at the crossing point between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, researchers have recovered a genuinely extraordinary collection of Homo erectus remains, including 5 relatively complete skulls, dated with real confidence to approximately 1,800,000 years ago, remarkably close to the very earliest African appearance of this same species. This means that within roughly 100,000 years, a genuinely brief span of time by the standards of this story, at least some populations of Homo erectus had already walked gradually and without any conceivable sense of a larger destination, thousands of miles beyond the African continent that had shaped every hominin ancestor before them. There was no plan behind this. There was almost certainly no single decisive journey undertaken by one determined group. What seems far more likely based on the slow incremental way populations typically expand across a landscape is a gradual drift, a small group moving somewhat further each generation following available food and water, occupying new territory as opportunity allowed, until that cumulative drift stretched patiently across many thousands of years had carried descendants of the original African population into an entirely different corner of the world. The Dmanisi skulls themselves offer a genuinely striking and genuinely moving detail that deserves real attention before we move any further. Among the 5 skulls recovered from this single site, one now referred to simply as Skull 5 belonged to an individual who had lost nearly all of their teeth well before death with the jawbone, showing clear evidence that the sockets had fully healed over, meaning this particular individual survived for a considerable period, likely years, after losing the ability to properly chew tough fibrous food on their own. This detail raises a genuinely important, if inevitably somewhat speculative question. How does an individual with severely limited chewing ability survive for years in a landscape as demanding as the one this story has described tonight, without some meaningful degree of help from others willing to share food that had already been softened, chewed, or otherwise prepared for easier eating? Some researchers have pointed to this particular individual as possible early evidence of genuine sustained social care extending towards someone who could no longer fully contribute to their own survival. A pattern that, if the interpretation holds, would represent something genuinely significant in the story of hominin cooperation. It is important to say plainly, however, that this particular interpretation remains debated among specialists, since it is also possible this individual simply survived on unusually soft available foods without requiring direct assistance, and the evidence, while suggestive, cannot fully settle the question either way. What allowed this remarkable geographic expansion to happen at all beyond the body itself finally being built for sustained efficient long-distance travel? A body alone, however well designed for walking, still needs food along the way, and researchers have increasingly focused attention on subtle changes to the human nose and respiratory system that appear based on skull structure to have developed roughly alongside this expansion. Unlike the flatter, wider nasal openings found in earlier hominins and in modern great apes, Homo erectus skulls show the beginning of a more prominent externally projecting nose, a shape that in modern humans plays a real functional role in warming and humidifying air before it reaches the lungs, an advantage that becomes considerably more valuable when traveling through drier, cooler, or higher altitude environments quite different from the humid conditions of equatorial Africa, where this entire lineage originated. Fire too enters this part of the story, though, with considerably more genuine uncertainty attached to it than popular imagination often assumes. Evidence of controlled fire use, meaning fire deliberately maintained and used repeatedly at a specific location, rather than simply the accidental aftermath of a natural wildfire, appears at a handful of archaeological sites, including Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, by roughly 1 million years ago. Associated with Homo erectus remains and tools found in the same layers. What remains genuinely debated among researchers is how widespread, how reliable, and how central to daily survival this early fire use actually was. Some scholars argue for meaningfully earlier and more consistent fire use, pointing to burned bone fragments and reddened sediment at several sites. Others urge real caution, noting how difficult it is to distinguish deliberate, controlled fire use from the scattered remains of a natural wildfire that simply happened to pass through an area where hominins were also present. The honest current answer is that fire almost certainly became a genuinely important part of hominin life at some point during this broader period, but exactly when it moved from occasional advantage to reliable everyday necessity remains an active, ongoing area of research rather than a settled fact. What is not in serious dispute is the sheer scale of what this expanding, increasingly capable population eventually achieved. Within a relatively short span of time by the standards of this entire evening, Homo erectus populations or close relatives descended from a similar African source appear in the fossil record across an extraordinary geographic range from Dmanisi in the west to sites across China, including significant remains recovered near Beijing beginning in the 1920s, to the Indonesian island of Java, where the very first Homo erectus fossils were actually discovered by a Dutch physician named Eugène Dubois back in 1891, decades before Lucy Hardy or any of the other discoveries central to tonight's story had even been made. Dubois had travelled to Southeast Asia specifically searching for what he called the missing link evidence connecting apes and modern humans, and his eventual discovery along the Solo River in Java, a skull cap and thigh bone belonging to what he initially named Pithecanthropus erectus, sparked genuine controversy and considerable public fascination at the time, decades before the broader scientific framework needed to properly interpret such a find had even been developed. There is something worth sitting with quietly here near the close of this particular part of the story in recognizing just how much distance, both physical and evolutionary, separates the small forest edge dwelling Ardipithecus described earlier tonight from the confident, far-travelling Homo erectus populations now being described. Roughly 2.5 million years separate these two moments in this unfolding story, a span of time genuinely difficult for any single human mind to hold fully in perspective, and yet, across that entire span, the underlying thread connecting every part of this evening's telling remains essentially unbroken, a lineage responding generation after patient generation to a forest that had disappeared, and to an open, demanding world that had to be met on its own difficult terms, using nothing more than a body slowly incrementally reshaped and a mind slowly incrementally expanded to do so. What remains to be seen and what still lies quietly ahead in this story is what all of this slow patient accumulation, the walking, the tools, the shared food, the travel distance is measured now in thousands of miles rather than mere steps between familiar trees actually left behind in the bodies and minds of people living now tonight in beds considerably more comfortable than anything these ancient travellers ever knew. Close your eyes for a moment if you have not already begun drifting towards sleep, and imagine the kind of landscape that feels, without any particular effort of thought, simply peaceful. For a great many people across a genuinely wide range of cultures and countries, that imagined landscape tends to share a surprisingly consistent shape: gently rolling grass, scattered broad canopied trees spaced comfortably apart rather than crowded together. Perhaps a distant view of water, calm and unhurried. It is worth asking gently and without any pressure to answer immediately why so many different people raised in such different places would land on something so remarkably similar when simply picturing rest. This particular question caught the attention of a small number of researchers beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the following decade, among them a psychologist named John Balling and a colleague named John Falk, who set out to test something that had until then remained largely an informal observation rather than a properly studied idea. They showed participants drawn from several different age groups and cultural backgrounds photographs of 5 distinct biome types: tropical rainforest, deciduous forest, coniferous forest, open savanna and desert. Then simply asked each participant which environment they would most prefer to live in or spend time within. Across nearly every age group tested, savanna consistently ranked as the preferred environment, with one particularly striking detail standing out from their results. Among the very youngest children studied, those who had not yet had extensive life experience or exposure to travel photography and nature documentaries, the preference for savanna over every other landscape type was, if anything, even more pronounced than among the adults in the same study. That detail is genuinely worth sitting with. If landscape preference were shaped entirely by personal experience, by growing up near a particular kind of terrain, or by cultural exposure through art, film and travel, one might reasonably expect children with the least such experience to show the weakest, least consistent preferences of anyone tested. What Balling and Falk found instead pointed, at least tentatively, towards something considerably older and less easily explained by individual upbringing alone, a preference that seemed to exist in some meaningful sense before culture had fully finished shaping a young mind. Researchers who have continued exploring this idea in the decades since, including psychologists Gordon Orions and Judith Heerwagen, have proposed what is sometimes called the savanna preference hypothesis, suggesting that this particular pull toward open scattered tree grassland may reflect something inherited quite literally from the environment our ancestors spent an enormous stretch of evolutionary time navigating the same shifting, semi-open landscape this entire evening has been describing in careful patient detail, Under this view, a landscape combining moderate open visibility, useful for spotting both food and approaching danger from a real distance, together with scattered trees offering genuine shade, safety, and a place to retreat if needed, would have represented something close to an ideal environment for a small, vulnerable, trying to survive on the African savanna, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. A preference for that particular combination the theory suggests may simply never have fully faded, carried forward quietly across an enormous span of subsequent human history, long after most people stopped needing it for literal daily survival. I want to be genuinely careful here in the spirit of honesty this channel tries to bring to every story, because this particular hypothesis, while genuinely interesting and supported by some real cross-cultural evidence, remains an area where scholars still debate exactly how much of this landscape preference is truly innate, inherited, quietly across countless generations, versus how much might instead be explained by other, less dramatic factors, including certain shared, practical qualities that almost any human culture might independently come to associate with safety and comfort, regardless of any specific evolutionary inheritance from the African savanna in particular. The evidence remains suggestive rather than fully conclusive, and it would be overstating the case to present this as a settled, proven fact rather than a genuinely compelling, still actively researched idea. What makes this particular theory feel worth including tonight, regardless of exactly how it is ultimately resolved by future research, is a detail many people have never consciously noticed about the designed landscape surrounding them in ordinary daily life. Frederick Law Olmsted, the American landscape architect responsible for designing New York Central Park in the 1850s, along with a considerable number of other major public parks across North America in the decades that followed, favored a particular design approach: broad, gently rolling stretches of open lawn, interrupted by carefully placed clusters of trees rather than the denser, more continuously wooded parkland common in many European garden traditions of that same period. Olmsted himself wrote about wanting to create landscapes that felt genuinely restorative, spaces where visitors could feel their attention and their nervous tension gradually ease, though he was working, of course, many decades before any formal scientific theory connecting landscape preference to deep evolutionary history had been proposed. Whether Olmsted was responding consciously or not to something genuinely deep and inherited in how people experience open tree-scattered landscapes, or whether he was simply drawing on more conventional aesthetic traditions of his own era, remains impossible to know with certainty. But it is a genuinely striking coincidence, if it is only a coincidence at all, that so many of the public spaces people today find most naturally calming, city parks, golf courses, even certain suburban lawns dotted with a handful of well-spaced shade trees, echo in their basic shape the very landscape this evening's story has spent so much time describing as the difficult, dangerous birthplace of upright walking humanity. There is a second, somewhat less peaceful example of this same deep inheritance worth mentioning, one that touches something closer to fear rather than comfort. A researcher named Lynn Isbell, working primarily in the early 2000s, proposed what has come to be known as the snake detection hypothesis, examining why humans and many other primates display such a remarkably fast, often deeply visceral fear response specifically towards snakes, a response that appears considerably faster and more automatic than the fear response most people show toward objects that are, statistically speaking, considerably more dangerous in modern daily life. Automobiles, for instance, or household electrical outlets. Isbell's research suggests that the particular visual processing regions in the primate brain most closely associated with detecting snakes quickly, even from a partial glimpse or an unusual pattern half hidden in grass or leaf litter, may have been shaped by an extraordinarily long evolutionary relationship between primates and venomous snakes. one stretching back considerably further than the specific period this evening has focused on, but one that would have remained a genuine, persistent daily danger throughout the entire long transition from forest to open grassland described across these last several parts. Scholars continue to debate certain specific details of Isbell's hypothesis, including exactly how much of this fear response is truly innate at birth versus rapidly and easily learned through even minimal early exposure or observation, since separating those two possibilities cleanly in real human infants and young children has proven genuinely difficult to study with full scientific rigor. What does seem reasonably well supported across multiple independent studies conducted in different laboratories is that snakes, more so than many other genuinely dangerous animals, do appear to capture and hold human visual attention with unusual speed and persistence, a pattern consistent with the idea that this particular fear, however it is ultimately transmitted from one generation to the next, carries some real trace of that ancient, dangerous relationship between primates and the grassland and woodland edges, where venomous snakes have always been especially difficult to spot in time. Beyond these particular inherited preferences and fears, the physical body itself, examined honestly and without exaggeration, still carries considerably more direct visible evidence of everything this evening's story has described. The lower back curved into its distinctive series of gentle compensating bends to keep an upright body balanced comfortably over its hips remains for a great many people today a genuine and quite common source of discomfort, particularly later in life or after long periods spent in postures the human spine never fully evolved to accommodate for extended stretches. Childbirth, too, remains measurably more physically demanding and more genuinely dangerous for humans than for almost any other primate. A direct ongoing consequence of the same narrowed pelvis that once made efficient upright walking possible for Lucy and her contemporaries, now needing to accommodate an infant's skull considerably larger relative to overall body size than anything Lucy herself would ever have needed to deliver. Even something as seemingly ordinary as human skin color distribution across the globe carries a quiet direct echo of this deep history. Populations whose ancestors remained across many thousands of generations in regions of intense near-equatorial sun exposure, similar to the open savanna environments described throughout tonight's story, generally evolved correspondingly. Higher levels of protective skin pigmentation, guarding against the genuine risks of sun damage that come with regularly exposed, largely hairless skin under direct, intense, equatorial sunlight. Populations whose more recent ancestors migrated over subsequent tens of thousands of years into regions considerably further from the equator, where sunlight arrives at a lower, more indirect angle for much of the year, generally evolved correspondingly lighter skin, allowing what limited available sunlight there was to still produce sufficient vitamin D through the skin, a genuinely vital nutrient that becomes considerably harder to synthesize efficiently through heavily pigmented skin under weaker, more indirect northern or southern sunlight. This entire genuinely elegant biological adjustment playing out gradually across tens of thousands of years and an enormous range of different latitudes, traces directly back to that same original loss of body hair and gain in sweat gland density described earlier. Tonight itself, a direct, hard-won adaptation to the relentless heat of the very open, sun-exposed landscape this story has followed our ancestors into. Even human endurance itself considered, carefully still carries a genuine, measurable trace of this ancient inheritance. Modern long-distance runners and the sport of marathon and ultramarathon running more broadly rely on precisely the same combination of traits described earlier. This evening, in relation to the endurance hunting hypothesis, an efficient upright gait, an extraordinarily effective evaporative cooling system built around dense sweat glands and exposed skin, and a genuinely unusual capacity among mammals generally for sustaining significant physical effort across considerable distance and time without succumbing to heat exhaustion nearly as quickly as most other similarly sized animals would. Some contemporary evolutionary biologists, including Daniel Lieberman at Harvard, have argued that this deep endurance capacity, however rarely most people today actually call upon its full potential in ordinary daily life, remains genuinely, miserably present in essentially every modern human body, a quiet, largely unused inheritance from a landscape and a survival strategy. Most people alive today will never personally need to rely upon in anything like its original life or death form. What might it mean then to consider all of these different threads together? The quiet pull toward open trees, scattered landscapes, the fast visceral fear of snakes, the persistent ache of a lower back never quite perfectly suited to a fully upright life, the careful biological calibration of skin color to available sunlight, the genuine if rarely tested endurance capacity built into ordinary human bodies today. None of these individual details taken entirely on their own would necessarily seem remarkable. Together, however, they begin to sketch something genuinely worth sitting with quietly, a portrait of the present moment, this very evening, this very body listening to these words as something considerably less separate from that ancient, difficult forest edge world than it might at first glance appear to be. The forest itself has been gone in any meaningful sense from the daily experience of most human beings for an extraordinarily long time, now replaced first by open savanna and eventually across many thousands of subsequent years. This evening has not yet had time to properly explore by farms, villages, cities, and now for a great many listeners tonight, a quiet bedroom considerably safer and more comfortable than anything Lucy, or Ardy, or even the confident, far-travelling Homo erectus populations described earlier could ever have imagined for themselves. And yet something of that original forest and everything that followed its slow, patient disappearance appears to remain quietly folded into bodies and minds that still, after everything, retain a genuine, measurable trace of exactly where and precisely how difficult a journey they actually came from. There is one particular image drawn from very nearly the beginning of this evening's story that I find myself wanting to return to now gently as we come close to the end of everything this long night has had to tell you. The image is the one I described very near the start of this evening, and I want to walk back into it now slowly with everything we have learned since sitting quietly behind it. Two sets of footprints pressed into wet volcanic ash at a place now called Laetoli, in what is today northern Tanzania, roughly 3,600,000 years ago. A larger set and a smaller set moving together at the same steady pace across perhaps 27 meters of open damp ground. We do not know who these two individuals were to each other. We do not know if they spoke in whatever limited way their kind may have communicated, or simply walked in the particular comfortable sound that sometimes exists between two beings who trust each other enough not to need words. What we know with real certainty is that they were walking upright, fully unmistakably upright at a moment in history, so early that the forest their more distant ancestors had called home for tens of millions of years had only just begun in earnest to disappear around them. I keep returning to that image tonight, because it holds inside one small ordinary moment almost everything this long story has actually been about. Not a battle, not a single dramatic collapse, just two figures walking together across ground that would not have existed for their kind to walk across at all had the world not already changed so profoundly beneath them. We have travelled a very long way since that first return to Laetoli early this evening. We began inside forests so ancient and so vast that the animals living within them could not have imagined a world beyond the canopy, a world where safety came from height, where sleep required climbing, where the ground below belonged to danger rather than daily life. We watched that world begin to thin, slowly, unevenly, driven by forces as distant and as seemingly unrelated as a mountain range rising on the far side of the world, quietly redirecting rain that had once reached deep into Africa's interior. We met Ardi caught genuinely between two worlds, her body already reshaping itself for a kind of walking her feet had not yet fully committed to. We met Lucy, whose pelvis and knee left no doubt at all about which world her body now belonged to, even as her curved fingers still remembered faintly the trees her ancestors had trusted for so long. We sat honestly with how dangerous that open world actually was, with leopards dragging their kills into caves with massive cats and powerful hyenas, sharing the same waterholes, the same grasslands, the same long-exposed hours between dawn and dusk. We considered carefully why walking upright was ever worth that danger at all, the saved energy, the reduced heat, the freed hands, each small advantage compounding quietly across an almost unthinkable span of time. We sat with real scientific disagreement too, the genuine ongoing debate among careful researchers about how much credit belongs to open savanna and how much belongs to trees that never fully let go, because that disagreement is itself part of an honest telling, not something to be smoothed over for the sake of a tidier story. We watched hands, finally and fully freed, learn to shape stone into something sharp enough to open a way toward meat, toward denser calories, toward a brain solely, expensively growing larger, demanding in return real cooperation, real shared food, real collective care for children who took longer to grow than any hominin child before them. And we watched that whole patiently rebuilt body finally walk beyond Africa, entirely carrying itself generation by careful generation into Georgia, into China, into the islands of what is now Indonesia, into an entire world their ancestors could never have known existed. What strikes me most, turning all of this over quietly now, near the end of this particular telling, is how little of it was ever a single decision. No hominin ever woke one morning and chose deliberately to leave the forest behind forever. No single individual invented upright walking or stone tools or fire in one flash of sudden understanding. It happened instead the way most truly significant things in a long life tend to happen, in small steps, taken without any clear sense of where they were ultimately leading, each one reasonable only in its own immediate moment, each one building almost invisibly on everything that came before it. There is something in that pattern worth carrying with you, I think well beyond tonight's particular story, because it is not only how a forest was left behind millions of years ago by animals who could not have understood what they were beginning, it is also in its own quiet way how almost anything difficult is ever actually survived. Not through one dramatic act of courage arriving fully formed and complete, but through a long accumulation of smaller, harder choices made without certainty, made without any guarantee of what would come next, made simply because the alternative, staying exactly where you were, had quietly gradually stopped being possible at all. The forest our ancestors left is gone now in any meaningful sense from nearly all of human daily life, and yet as we sat with earlier tonight, something of it remains folded quietly into the very shape of the bodies listening to these words right now. A pull toward open tree-scattered landscapes that still without any real thought behind it feels like rest. A visceral, immediate fear of something coiled and hidden in grass older than language itself. A lower back that still, after everything, carries the quiet cost of standing upright rather than remaining on all fours. A capacity for sustained endurance rarely tested by most people alive today, but still genuinely measurably present, waiting largely unused inside almost every ordinary human body. This is, I think, the real lasting gift of a story this old, this slow, this genuinely brutal in what it actually asked of the small, frightened creatures living through it. It teaches gently and without any need for exaggeration that resilience does not usually announce itself. It rarely feels from the inside like triumph. It looks far more often like simply continuing one difficult day at a time, one generation quietly making do with slightly less forest than the generation before it had known, until enough of those difficult days had passed that something genuinely new and genuinely capable had been built almost without anyone intending it. Let the pace slow now. Let the story rest. Somewhere on a morning, so distant it can barely be held in the mind, ash falls softly across open ground. Rain follows gentle ordinary rain, settling that ash into something that will hold a shape. Two figures move across it together, not hurrying, not afraid in this particular moment of anything at all. Just walking side by side the way a people still walk together on ordinary evenings for no larger reason than the quiet comfort of not walking alone. Their prints sink into the soft ground, small, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone who might have seen them that morning and thought nothing more of it. And then the ash hardens, and the world moves on the way it always does, forgetting almost everything the way it always does. Except this. Except these two walking quietly together, held now for longer than memory itself, longer than any name, any voice, any single human life could ever hope to last. Still walking, still together, long after everything else has gone quiet.